All right, so today is continuing on some basic information about the field of science called psychogastroenterology, which is the science of the gut-brain connection specifically for GI disorders. So today's topic is the two types of digestive disorders. As a quick review as to what was discussed last video, the field of psychogastroenterology focuses on the gut-brain connection, which has led to a lot of new understanding about how GI disorders function. And part of that research is the impact of stress on GI disorders. All chronic health conditions in general are worsened by stress, but GI disorders in particular are sensitive to stress compared to other disorders. And part of the reason why is the gut-brain connection or the gut-brain axis. So the gut and the brain are intimately connected via a two-way flow of information. And when all of that is functioning correctly, this connection works like a feedback loop that keeps both the brain and the body in a state of balance. And when something dysregulates the nervous system for an extended period of time, like a significant stress, a life stress, something big happening like a divorce or anything big that can significantly stress you, or prolonged insomnia or an infection, this can disrupt the gut-brain communication. And the signaling can start to get a little haywire, and it can turn the feedback loop into a vicious cycle, similar to this type of cycle right here, where stress causes symptoms and symptoms cause more stress. So in this vicious cycle, the dysregulation of one part can spread to the other. So people with GI symptoms are more likely to develop anxiety and depression over time compared to people that don't have GI symptoms. And because of the gut-brain connection going both ways, the reverse is also true. People that have anxiety and depression are more likely to develop GI symptoms over time. And so an easy way to see this or to think about this is the worse your health gets, the more you naturally become anxious. And the more anxious you get, the more urge you get to control things. And the more you follow that urge to control out of fear and control out of a sense of anxiety, the more you start to do things that ultimately make the problem feel more stressful or more dire, which just further fuels the anxiety and the urge to control and on and on. It's helpful to understand the two main types of GI disorders to begin to learn more about how this might be playing out for you. So the first type are called structural GI disorders, often called organic disorders or organic diseases. Examples of this would be gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD for short, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, ulcers, diverticulitis, cancer. And with a structural GI disorder, there are symptoms, and a doctor can use a procedure like an upper endoscopy or a colonoscopy. They can take biopsies or use any of the other range of tests or scopes or scans and be able to see evidence of the disorder or the disease in the GI tract. And the test might also help determine what's the possible cause of these symptoms. For example, if someone has a chronic burning sensation in their chest after eating and they get an upper endoscopy, which shows that there's evidence of inflammation in the esophagus, then it makes it clear that most likely what's going on here is GERD. And it can help to get to the source or the root of kind of what's causing these symptoms. And often, like GERD, a lot of structural GI disorders involve chronic inflammation. And the second type of disorder is what's called a functional GI disorder. For these types of disorders, when tests are done, the doctor comes back and says, we didn't really find anything. Everything looks normal. Nothing. We didn't find anything wrong. So endoscopies or x-rays or blood tests, they all come back normal. What this means is that the symptoms that are present, they're not due to inflammation or something structurally wrong with the digestive tract or something like cancer. What this doesn't mean, though, is that it's all in your head or that it's quote unquote just anxiety. Functional GI disorders are real disorders, but we just don't have good tests for them yet at this point. They're tricky because they don't play out like a traditional disease or disorder like GERD or an ulcer. The most common types of these functional disorders are IBS, or functional dyspepsia, which is indigestion. There's functional heartburn, which is heartburn that's not due to GERD. Functional dysphagia, which is difficulty swallowing or like a chronic sense of like a ball in your throat. And another one would be chronic nausea vomiting syndrome. So these are the most common types of disorders that people encounter. And finally, it's also important to note that there's an overlap between these two. Many people with structural GI disorders can also have a functional disorder on top of that. What this means is that if tests show you're in remission, if tests show your inflammation is under control, and all the markers of the disease or disorder are normalized, but the symptoms are persisting, what this means is that something else is causing these symptoms, and that's most often a functional GI disorder. So it's also helpful to know that functional is not actually the best term to use for this second type of disorder. In 2016, gastroenterologists got together and they updated the term to a more useful and an accurate one: disorders of the gut-brain interaction. So similar to psychogastroenterology, disorders of the gut-brain interaction is quite a mouthful, but it is a useful term to really know what that is, and that this term is the more accurate one. And one of the main reasons why they updated this term is because in the past, functional GI disorders were known as a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning if a doctor couldn't figure out what's causing your symptoms, then by default, you would be given a functional GI label. And what this led to over time was a false misperception or a false perception that within medicine, that organic diseases or organic disorders or structural disorders are the real disorders, and functional disorders are less legitimate, or they're just a result of anxiety or some type of mental health issue. So that is not the reality, though. It's one that unfortunately perpetuated for a long time, still perpetuates even within medicine. But it's helpful for patients to be able to be aware of that is no longer the current research-based term disorder of the gut-brain interaction is, and it legitimizes the disorder itself. So I just personally will use the term functional and DGBI, or disorder gut-brain interaction, interchangeably, just because functional is just a lot easier to say, but it's important to know that this is the accurate term. So to go a little further on DGBIs, the gut-brain interaction, or the gut-brain axis, when it's out of balance and the communication becomes faulty, this, like what I was outlining before, this is the root cause of disorders of the gut-brain interaction. Medical scientists have proven this, but there's just no easy way to test for that. There's no blood test that shows this kind of process happening. So that is part of the reason why this becomes a confusing or muddy territory. Getting more clear on it, something that is helpful to get more clear on it, at least, is the role of stress. So stress is a really big part of how this all happens. Like it was said before, the system can get disrupted when something big dysregulates the nervous system for an extended period of time, like a big life stress or prolonged insomnia or an infection, for example. And so while this is a big part of how this happens, it's not actually the cause of the disorder to begin with. It's just not that simple. So stress doesn't cause structural disorders. It doesn't cause disorders of the gut-brain interaction, but it's a huge factor for increasing the chances of developing one. A good way to understand this is that the good way to understand the role of stress in all of this is that even though it didn't necessarily cause it straight out, it's a metaphor would be like how like a fire in the body. I said this in the last video, but it's worth repeating here. Hopefully it's worth repeating. The metaphor would be that the disorder or the syndrome or the disease is like a fire in the body, and chronic stress is like kindling building up, like a whole bunch of dried twigs and leaves dried leaves and twigs don't start a fire, but they increase the chances of a spark turning into a fire. And then once a disorder, disease, or syndrome develops, once a spark happens and the fire starts, then stress is like logs being thrown onto the fire. It fuels it. It continues and grows or further develops the disease or the dysfunction or the disorder. So again, stress didn't cause your symptoms, but it very likely makes them worse. And if you have a structural GI disorder, stress is a significant factor in influencing the severity of your disease. So inflammatory conditions like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, stress in the research of this, stress is one of the strongest risk factors for increasing the risk for surgery, for hospitalization, disability, severity of flares. And then if you have a functional or a disorder of the gut-brain interaction, stress is not only a significant factor in influencing the severity of your disorder, it's considered the primary factor. So really knowing which type of disorder you have is an important step. So the key takeaways here are that chronic GI disorders, they're messy, they're confusing, they're difficult to get under control. And knowing which category applies to you is an important step or important piece of the puzzle. And effective stress management targeted to your specific symptoms is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's just one part. It's an effective piece if it's in complement to other pieces, especially, really effective medical care. And knowing what type of disorder and how severe it is helps you to figure out your priority list of when these skills should be addressed and when some other treatments need to come first. Unfortunately, some people skip that step. Unfortunately, it's quite common, especially for disorders of the gut-brain interaction or functional disorders, for people to not pursue medical care for it. Part of the reason is the research shows at least one significant factor is the role of shame. So beyond that, though, if you and your doctor are clear on which categories apply to you, and you do some homework on how much you think that the types of things I'm talking about apply to you, you can start to get much more clear on the priority list of what's going to be most helpful for your healing plan. Number two, if you have a structural disorder, you can explore whether you might also have a disorder of the gut-brain interaction overlapping as well. And this could help really explain some symptoms and help you know what to prioritize things differently. Me personally, I have Crohn's disease, and apparently I also have IBS too, because there are periods where I'm in remission according to all the tests, but symptoms still persist. So that really helps me figure out what I need to be addressing. And then number three, if you have a disorder of the gut-brain interaction and aren't familiar with that term or the type of information I'm sharing here, a useful step would be to start reading about this stuff. And finally, it's really worth repeating that even though disorders of the gut-brain interaction or functional GI disorders are the most common type, because they can't be validated by a scope or a test currently, it's easy to fall victim to the all too common idea that it's all in your head or it's just anxiety. This is not true. Unfortunately, people are told this by their doctors still, but this is not true. These are real disorders, and there are effective treatments if you can educate yourself and you can advocate for yourself as well. So one last slide here, or two last slides, I should say. The one resource that's useful to know that exists is the Rome Foundation. Speaking of kind of doing homework and educating yourself, this would be a fantastic resource. If you can just Google the Rome Foundation, it should be easy to find. And it's an organization based on bringing awareness to disorders of the gut-brain interaction. There's a lot of great educational materials. If you go to the website and here's like the toolbar on top or the menu on top and go to resources, here's a really good place to start. Video library for providers and patients. Some of this information and videos will be for doctors because part of this foundation is helping to educate doctors on all this stuff, but a whole bunch of it will be for patients as well. And then for real, the last thing I wanted to share with you is I'm just going to give you a sneak peek of the upcoming topics. I'm going to do a 3-part series next on understanding the gut-brain connection through 3 core concepts. And so here are the core concepts, at least visually, that are going to be covered. And the first core concept is this visual right here that we'll get into next video.